Okay guys, I'm just wanting to go over very quickly some of the key things that we've talked about so far. So first of all, I just want to reiterate the fact that site-specific performance is a contested term. There's multiple different definitions put out there by numerous academics and theatre makers that tries to get to the heart of what we mean by site-specific. And for my part, there doesn't really seem to be a singular definition of one or two sentences which fully encompasses all the broad range of work which happens in relation to a selected location. So we need to be very wary when we're using definitions that we're not leaving out particular relationships between the performance makers and the site. Secondly, I suggest that sited performance might be a more general term that might help us understand performance work which is attentive to the location in which it's produced. So sited performance might help us bring all these different modes together just to help us signal a type of work in a selected location. Thirdly, and importantly, I would say that what defines a performance has a lot more to do with what those are making it are doing rather than the locations themselves. So you don't get places that are sites and places that are not sites. As I've said, it's more to do with the intentions of those that are making it. It's people, it's performance makers that carry out the duty of turning places into sites through their interaction, through the intention of making performance work. So 4, discovering. Okay, so the fourth thing that I would say is that trying to figure out what definition a performance comes under, whether or not it's site-specific, site-generic, whatever, what category of site-specific it might be, is far less important than it is to ask the appropriate questions of this kind of work. So it's more important to ask questions like, what relationship does the performance have to its location? What does the performance draw our attention to that we might not otherwise gain without that performance? What did the site offer the performance? What of the site did the performance draw on in the context of the work? So what did the performance makers actually bring into their performance work? Why did they select that location? Why was it important to do it at that place? Was it important to do it at that place? Those are perhaps more important questions to ask, rather than sitting and worrying about whether or not the work is site generic or site specific, or trying to pigeonhole it into a category. Ask the right questions of the work so that you can get to the heart of what it is that these theatre makers are doing. Okay, so that's just a broad recap of the kind of key things that I want to get across. I'm now going to go over briefly, very briefly, some other key terms that are associated and always seem to come up when we talk about site-specific performance. Now these terms are space, place and non-place. So it's natural that as site-specific work began to develop and you started to get a broader range of theatre modes to try and that really tried to explore particular locations, we also, as academics, try to then understand better what these different performance modes are doing. And so it's natural for us to rely on a broad range of academic work that's already going on. So when we're trying to understand the specificities of place, space, non-place and stuff, we usually will borrow from other disciplinary optics. So we might go and look at cultural geography, for example, or anthropology, or cultural theorists, for example, in order to gain a better understanding of key terms like space, place, landscape, etc. Because these are the disciplines that have really been primarily looking at that for the last 50, 60 years. So it's important for us as theatre scholars and theatre makers, in order to understand these things, to go and have a look at these other disciplines in order to get a better idea. So I'm just going to very briefly, and that's the proviso here, that I'm just going to skim over this, explain the differences between space and place, and then place and non-place. I'm going to do this first of all by drawing reference to a cultural theorist called Michel de Certeau, in his book that he wrote called The Practice of Everyday Life, which he wrote in 1984, within which he discusses the spatial practices. I mean, that's the preliminary focus of that work. And he really goes to great lengths to try and distinguish the difference between space and place. So he says, and I'm going to read here, I hope you forgive me, that place refers to the locational instination of what is considered to be customary, proper, and even pre-established. A place is the order of whatever kind in accord with which elements are distributed in relationships of coexistence. Okay, so I suppose what that really is talking about is that a place is kind of the architecture or the lie of the land as it is before we think of interaction within it. A place is simply the bedrock, the bare bones of it, if you like. And space, on the other hand, has none of that stability and is composed of, and I quote here, intersections of mobile elements, right, which are ambiguous and often in conflict with each other. So space, quote, occurs as the effect produced by the operations that orient it, situate it, temporalise it, and make it function. You see? So space is therefore practiced, it's lived in. It's a street where people are constantly moving in between. It's a house where people are living in. So we start to see the difference here. You know, the place is just like the architecture. It's the lie of the land. It's the way that it's all set out. The topography. Place is that. Space is when there's interaction, there's movement, there's people, there's animals, there's an environment that is sort of drawn on. De Certeau is also concerned with the transformative nature of spaces and places. So he says that there's no such thing as like a fixed place or a fixed space. He suggests that stories or performance carries out a labour that constantly transforms places into spaces or spaces into places. You see? So humans, and I would suggest as well, sort of non-human elements, constantly have the ability of changing these things back and forward. So an empty lane is just a place until you start to walk down it. And Rights and Sights sort of draw on this a little bit, I think, when they quote in their sort of misguide to Anywhere, when they state that anybody who's sort of stood in the early hours of the morning after fresh snow has laid will know that the first footsteps and the first walker across that snow changes everything, you see. And I think that's a really good quote, or a really good sort of explanation of what we think of here. A beach is just a place when there's no footsteps in the sand, you see. Human interaction or animal interaction helps turn a place into a space, and we need to be aware of that transformative element. So performance does this. We might choose a place in order to make work. Okay, so these terms are fluid and unfixed. That's the point that we need to bear in mind, that we might be using spaces, places, and we need to understand these differences, okay? A place becomes space through habitual actions, movements, and interactions between people or non-human agents, okay? So that's the difference between space and place. And just very, very briefly, and I would say that I would urge you to go and have a look at The Practice of Everyday Life by de Certeau, because he talks about this in great detail and far more depth than I'm covering it now. But I'm just trying to give a little taste for getting in between these specifics here. And I want to talk to you as well about Marc Augé. So in this book, An Introduction to Supermodernity, Augé sets out to distinguish a place from a non-place. And again, I mean, Auger is an anthropologist, so he's really trying to get to the heart of the human experience and how we understand our relationship to environment and things like that. So he states that, quote, if a place can be defined as rational, historical and concerned with identity, which is what de Certeau is arguing, then a space which cannot be defined as rational, historical or concerned with identity will be a non-place. Okay, so Auger's work explores human relationships within the environment of transient spaces in particular, or what you might call the liminal space. It's a sort of betwixt and between. And he as examples of these kinds of non-places, he talks about supermarkets or hotels or airport terminals as being non-places. Auger's central argument is that certain places, like I've just mentioned, are non-relational, non-historical, and they're not concerned with identity and are therefore non-places. So passengers on an airplane, for example, share no necessary relation to each other beyond the simple and accidental fact of the circumstances which brought them to be there for those few hours. That desire to travel from one location to another is the only reason why they're situated there. It's not anything that's bound in a sort of cultural or habitual sort of relationship. So that's very, very brief. If you want to do more, go and have a look at that. Go and have a look at that book. So I'm just trying to skim over here the difference between space, place, and non-place. So yeah, I think that'll do us just now.